Welcome to Conversations and Connections. At the outset, I acknowledge that I'm speaking from Melbourne on lands that were colonized from Indigenous people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we have someone with us who has traveled very far and wide to come and teach here in Australia. Dr. Malini Sur is a social and cultural anthropologist who teaches at Western Sydney University. She studies agrarian borderlands in Asia, urbanization, and environmental issues. Her recent book that we're going to discuss today is Jungle Passports, Fences, Mobility and Citizenship at the Northeast India-Bangladesh Border. And it was published earlier this year in 2021 by the University of Pennsylvania Press in the United States. Those following the news from South Asia, and more particularly the corner of the globe that Malini works on, will immediately recognize the urgency for dialogue on all the aspects that she does research on. But I shall let her talk more about it now. Welcome, Malini, and thank you for agreeing to this conversation.
Thanks a lot for your kind invitation. Today I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Darug people. I also pay my respects to elders past, present, and emergent. And this land has, never been ceded, and it never will.
Thank you. So, Malini, you know how it's an amazing book. Congratulations on having published it and having worked at it for so long. Can we begin with you telling us what these jungle passports exactly are? Are they official documents acknowledged by the state, or are they fictional things?
No, they're not fictional. Jungle passports, it's not an expression that I've used or I've imposed as a kind of a catchy title to draw the attention of my readers. It is an expression that emerged from my fieldwork. It is an expression that is frequently invoked in one specific stretch of the borderland that I studied since 2007 along Northeast India and Bangladesh. And it's precisely, Honjoy, what an official passport is not. A national passport is rooted to very definitive notions of territory and national citizenship. It is delimited by national boundaries. Mobility is restricted. It is mediated through a series of papers. Jungle passports is precisely what national passport is not. These are claims of trans-border indigeneity, access to resources, the ability to move between trans-border spaces without claiming land as political territory, mind you. So it's about a sense of shared indigeneity. It's about using the partial forest cover of the region to move, to make a living. And that living is at the level of subsistence living. So these are patterns of moral claim making. Now, if you look at the kind of movements, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that jungle passports are paperless. There's a very long tradition in the study of undocumented migration, especially if you look at the sanctuary movement along the US-Mexico border, if you look at the claims of people without papers in France and in other countries, there's a very strong scholarly acknowledgement that there are forms of moral assertions, there are forms of political claim making that transcend, the narrow definitions of legitimacy and citizenship that are offered by the nation state, that we take as a kind of our threshold and parameter for identity and belonging. Unfortunately, in South Asia, the entire, scholarly discourse on migration is driven by xenophobia. It's driven by, claims to rootedness and claims to identity, which often stands at the crossroads of the kind of paperless travel, the kind of undocumented travel that ordinary people living along various other borders, not just South Asia's borders, not just the Northeast India-Bangladesh border, but various other borders, engage in as a form of everyday life.
That's a great way to begin this conversation, I guess. And there's something that you said about the place that you were talking of, right? And you said people who have subsistence existence. Can you just talk us through what this subsistence existence means?
Look, if I look at the the kind of shared regions and similar societies that the Northeast India Bangladesh border divides, people move back and forth across it, and they make a living and they earn about a little less than what is the minimum wage on either side of the border. And the moral logic that accompanies the kind of trans-border subsistence trade is also sanctioned by the sense that profits are kept at minimum. And the goods that people trade in, that is morally sanctioned also by borderland communities, are goods that are seen as socially acceptable. So goods that do not harm bodies, goods that do not harm minds. It's not about trading in gold, or it's not about trading in contraband. It's about trading in everyday grains and everyday vegetables and in staples. It's about trading in, export surplus garments. It's a range of these items that villagers across both sides of the border need, and that, there's a traffic in these kind of very ordinary goods.
Mm-hmm. You use the word community right now. And as I was reading your book, the idea of kinship recurs in various chapters. And, can you tell us how it became such an important lens in your work?
Kinship started crystallizing very much along the Garo borderland, by which I mean parts of Mymensingh and Netrakona districts of Bangladesh, and parts of the Garo Hills of Meghalaya. And I'm really talking about a foothill border region and a partly plain border region where people have cultivated rice for a long period of time. Now, when in 1947, India came to be partitioned, and a land, the Radcliffe's line ran through farmlands, forests, rivers, and what have you. And we know that story, right? There's a very rich history of that story. There's a very rich people's history of what the partition did and the kind of violence it generated. One of the things that are relatively less investigated about that story is that among the foothill and the lowland Garos, Radcliffe's line also divided the kinship line, or the Mahari. Now, people belonging to the same Mahari suddenly became Indians and Pakistanis, right? Because the border divided them. And there I was presented with a kind of a social life where my taken for granted assumptions on kinship as an anthropologist, kinship as lineage, kinship as something that is bounded by ethnicity and territory, kinship that only relates to questions of blood, questions of lineage and property, came to be challenged in various ways, especially because of the kind of Garo women's transporter mobility that I came to be exposed to and introduced to. And mind you, as we know, this part of the border is also very, very heavily militarized, like other regions. There are groups that seek independent homelands. And amidst all of that, elderly Garo women and other women traders and Mahari members continue to move on both sides of the border, also to maintain their relationships, but not just relationships within the same Mahari, but they also start establishing deeper relationships of trust, dependency, protection with border troops who man and kind of guard these borders. And that's where, this entire analytic potential of kinship as a political project, as one that opens up new ways of thinking about political possibilities and political identities kind of started unfolding through the movement of women across these transborder spaces. And that's when I realized that, this entire pattern of kinship and the relationships of kinship that are being fostered also includes strangers and non-Garos in that, in their kind of a social world.
It's wonderful that you talk of this social world, and it's there all through the book, in all the chapters. But can you a little bit explain the geography, the unique geography that you're talking about? Because for me, I think this idea of nation building is so prevalent today, whether it's in India or in Bangladesh, that somehow a lot of students, especially if they don't live in the border areas, grow up thinking that the map that is drawn on their geography kind of textbooks is something that exists really on the ground, right? And therefore they think that infrastructure and everything, migration infrastructure should kind of be determined by that map. Could you talk at length about, what kind of geography exists here? That is it really like that, or are we talking of fluid spaces? What are we talking about here?
I think if we think about the entire region that I write about in Jungle Passports, it's a kind of a odd triangular shaped cone of sorts that comprises regions that are low-lying, shifting shores. And these are fluid geographies, and you know this better than me, where the land itself moves and creates new kinds of possibilities of cultivation and identity. And, alongside this are also the kind of disruptive tectonic plates. And there's a long history of earthquakes in the region. One of the most massive ones was in 1897. And what actually happens as a consequence of that earthquake is an entire hill collapses, and the entire boundary between the Garo Hills and the shores of Assam that were completely obscured from view becomes absolutely flattened due to the kind of ruptures that the earthquake creates. Now, if you move from the kind of shifting shores right up to the low-lying regions of the Garo foothills, you see that, the land changes, the patterns of mobility change, but the entire question of infrastructure comes back to haunt us, both in terms of our ethnic as well as our national identities in this particular region, not just through the kind of fences and other border fortifications that we have created, but through a grain, rice. It becomes one of the very important markers of alterity, difference, and indeed one of the reasons why this entire region came to be militarized in very specific ways.
I mean, you kind of zeroed in on rice, and this has been such a intensely studied project for a lot of nationalist historians in Assam as well. That rice is something that Assamese farmers grow, and Bengali farmers grow something else. Clearly, that's not true, right? And can you just tell us a little bit more about this? This geographical tag that almost gets attached to farmers in this region.
So let me begin with a group of farmers I met in Bangladesh along, the Mymensingh border. So, and all of them, despite our shared language, which was Bengali, absolutely insisted speaking to me in Ohomia, and they said that they're Assamese and they have tilled the land of Assam. And despite all the shared connections that I had with them, all the conversations that I had recorded in that entire phase of my fieldwork were all in Assamese. Now, there is a vast, wealth of information, which especially historians of Assam have looked at, especially during the period of, the late 1930s onwards, 1940s and 50s. This is a period where food production, as we know, becomes a bone of contention between the Assam Congress and the Muslim League, where food production on the one hand is seen as a way of enticing undocumented settler peasants from Mymensingh and other areas, and on the other hand, it's seen as something that is absolutely necessary to support the plantation economy of Assam. And among the scholars I'm thinking about particularly right now is Aurjyoti Saikia's work, but also Joyita Sharma's work, in which she shows how this kind of a, food growing economy was absolutely central to supporting the plantation economy of Assam. Now, there's a saying, and you know this as an anthropologist, that anthropologists meddle where historians fear to tread. And unfortunately, this is what happened. In that, I came upon, farmers in Bangladesh who insisted they were Assamese, and there were other farmers who were in Assam who, at the mention of questions of citizenship and identity, would rush to their old pin trunks and take out all these land documents to prove they were Assamese. So there was an entire movement of landless peasants, but there was also a mobilization of landless peasants at this particular point of time. And we have to think about, figures like Maulana Bhashani, who is famous and infamous on both sides of the border for completely different reasons. So two things happened. In my understanding, two things happened. One, there was land erosion, land loss in various parts of Eastern Bengal. But there was also this kind of anticipation and slogan saying Assam Chalo. There was an anticipation that there was free cultivable land that was available. That was very different in terms of its taxation parameters. Now, the Muslim peasantry, the landless peasantry in Bengal, were toiling under a very oppressive Hindu landlord system. So compared to those kind of oppressions, the kind of so-called empty lands of Assam, these were not empty lands. The grazing reserves, the forests were not empty lands. But there was this whole movement of peasants who started tilling and cultivating land. And, when we think about the chores, we're constantly talking about the chores as ephemeral spaces. And they are indeed, because at any point, the course of the river can change and the chore can completely disappear. And there's a whole, other narrative of land loss that unites these kind of fluid spaces in both Assam and Bangladesh. But what we also need to remember is that the land is then very laboriously reclaimed and put into maximum use and made into cultivable land and made into, productive sites. And all that gives rise to a very specific kind of politics of identity, or very specific kinds of belonging.
I mean, thank you so much for bringing the conversation back to land. I think it gives me an opportunity to kind of segue to what the Assamese geologist, Professor Dulal Goswami, once said, that of the region that you and I are talking about, that geography, humans, and wildlife will always have to coexist in some form or the other in the part of the world that you've done research in. He explained that water would always find its way from upstream to downstream, regardless of what kind of obstacles we put in the way. And animals will always find higher ground. But he was not sure as to how human beings would figure out what to do and how they would navigate the future. What do you make of this anecdotal wisdom in the light of the kind of changes happening in the border?
I think there was keen insight in this remark of Professor Goswami, uh, who's obviously absolutely well known in the field of river basin management, and I think he's paid such close attention to the Brahmaputra's changing morphologies, to questions of sedimentation, to questions of load within the river basin, and very meticulously mapped these changes. I'm thinking of so many scholars, who work on Northeast India, and scholars from Northeast India at this moment. I'm thinking about, of course, your work on the rhinoceros. I'm thinking about Man Borowa's work on the elephants. I'm also thinking about his work on animals as infrastructures. I'm thinking about Dolly Kikon's work on dogs and the entire racialization of discourses. I'm thinking about, I'm also thinking about scholarship in comparative literature. I'm thinking about Amit Rahul Baisya's work on the Anthropocene and the non-human. And I believe very recently, Aruni has translated a story from Assamese to English. Aruni Kashyap has translated a story from Assamese to English, which is to do with animals. It's bookmark. I have to get there. I think it's about a rat or a snail.
It's a snail, I think. And also, Sean Dowdy's work on fish.
Absolutely. Sean was the other scholar I was about to bring up. And also, I think his work on mnemonics is very, very, very critical. So, you don't need more evidence that, the confluence of ecologies, the confluence of infrastructures, and these elements, ecologies, infrastructures, militarization, non-human worlds, absolutely work in tandem in the regions that all of us are exploring. And again, if you go back to the different ways in which people express their relationship with non-human animals, with totems, with other sacred objects, I'm also thinking about the rich literature on sacred groves. It's a much older literature, but I'm thinking about, B.K. Roy Burman and others. And I think it's absolutely impossible to ignore these connections, and you can't even ignore these connections in urban spaces. We can take these connections absolutely for granted in rural. And I've just picked up Ceasefire City by Duncan McDoura and Dolly Kikon. And there's an entire fascinating chapter on hunting, and I'm also thinking about, as I'm reading the chapter on hunting, and I'm, kind of going through the narratives of the hunters themselves in this kind of peri-urban zone. So absolutely, I think Dulal was...
For those who are listening to us, this is a book about Dimapur, which is in Nagaland. Yeah.
Right. Dimapur. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Yeah. So Dulal Goswami, I think, was absolutely right. I mean, there's no way that... And I think what is particularly interesting now is the diverse ways in which scholars who are working on Northeast India, and here I'm also thinking about Naveda Khan's work in the chores of Bangladesh, and she talks about people's relationship with dogs, and these relationships also are metaphysical. They transcend the material world in so many ways. So I think there's something very interesting about the kind of work that has emerged in Northeast India, especially in the last 5 to 6 years, where scholars are extremely attentive to the non-human turn in anthropology and geography and comparative literature.
Thanks so much. I mean, this is such a great way to kind of segue away from your book now. And you've got to tell us, How do you bring in so much history and so much detail, complexity into the classroom when you teach?
Hanjoy. So I was teaching. We are in the spring semester here in Australia now. It's winter. I think both of us, the audience, will know that we're in the middle of winter, and it's actually very easy because the university spaces that we inhabit, the kind of pathways that we walk on, especially our Parramatta South campus comprises of Western Sydney Uni, comprises a series of very old historic buildings. My office is located in what was formerly a psychiatric asylum, where at one given point of time, British legal norms ruled the kind of interventions in mental illness here, and soldiers who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, women who showed religious excitement or were undergoing menopause, and a whole lot of others were clubbed together under then, kind of historical notions of lunacy. So I think history is something that we are constantly living in the present. And I think the conversation that anthropology has with history is a very long one, and it's a very rich one, And for me, particularly, things started falling into place. As an anthropologist, I had only intended to follow the construction work of border fences and other infrastructures and situate them in the contemporary moment. But there were all these little things that emerged from my fieldwork, which forced me to retrace my steps back in time. And it wasn't as if I sat in an archive and I felt history was happening. History actually emerged from what people were telling me, which actually forced me to the archive back again. And finally, I've situated in Jungle Passports, I've situated the border in a 200-year history of land and identity conflict. So in the classroom, I teach courses in anthropology and sociology. There are always these brilliant, detours that you take, where you situate social theory in that particular time, in that history, and therefore you're not just traveling across geographies, but you're also traveling across time in very interesting ways. And I think there's a lot that we do also in anthropological theory that's immensely historical.
Thank you so much, Malini. I think I have one last question for you now. Tell us a little bit about your new research and the kind of conversations and connections that you foresee between academics in Australia and India in the future.
Honja, when we moved here 5 years ago, and it was a period of intense drought that farmers were facing. And even while living in a city, we were extremely attentive to the kind of havoc that nature was causing at that particular point of time. And then came the bushfires. Mm-hmm. And the bushfires happened at a moment that, I was in India, in Kolkata, conducting fieldwork on air pollution and urban cyclists and repair. And I had spent 6 months there doing fieldwork. And I returned right in the middle of the bushfires. And all of a sudden, I opened my window one day and I felt I was back in the smog and the haze. And that made me think about, of course, particulate matter, pollution. But it also made me think very distinctively about the kind of climatic as well as urban transformations that Australian cities are also witnessing. So I became very interested in looking at groundbreaking practices, in looking at, the kind of changing morphologies of the urban form. I became very interested in questions of dust, smoke, and haze in Australia. And these are the kind of themes that I'm continuing to explore as we speak now. The most recent project that I'm a part of, it's a wonderful collaboration. I'm a part of a team that's going to look at a people's museum along with the Museum of Applied Arts in Sydney and Parramatta. That's where my interests in visual anthropology, which I really got a chance to hone in Northeast India and Bangladesh, will, I suppose, give some dividends. I'm very, very hopeful about Australia-India relations. You may have seen the Australia-India Economic Partnership Plan, which has a vision right up to 2035. There's also a vision of key states in India that Australia is going to focus on. And I think it's a great policy document. But in addition to all the ongoing, collaborations that Australian universities have, especially in the fields of agriculture and the natural sciences, including my own university, I think there are immense possibilities in the social sciences and humanities to develop scholarly exchanges, to think across disciplinary boundaries, to have student exchanges. I definitely hope that we have more collaborations with joint PhD programs. And I see a lot of possibilities. And I think it's also important that because, Indian students have traditionally, because of historical and colonial links, moved either to England or to Europe or to the US. I think this is the right time to kind of, because of the nature of geopolitics and the changing configurations of employment, I think this is really the right time for academics, practitioners in Australia and India to build bridges and forge new connections.
On that wonderful note, Malini, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can speak to you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on board.